Good time of day, dear colleagues, and welcome to the first lecture of our course in quantitative and qualitative research methods in psychology. Today, we're going to discuss some theoretical and methodological issues that define our research approaches, and it will be the only time when we will discuss some more or less abstract methodological aspects of our research. But I think this is really important because these methodological issues need to be resolved sometimes in order for us to choose our research approach and to be aware of the limitations of our interpretations, because basically we need to have a context in our head. So today we will start by discussing the issue of ideal of science in psychology. What kind of science psychology is? Why is it not the same as natural sciences or humanities? And what are the alternative research methodologies that we can use as psychologists? Of course, if you have some background in psychology, many of those issues and things will be familiar to you. So you can just skim through this first lecture and skim through the literature a little bit to just make sure that you're familiar with those. But if this is the first time you're taking some psychology course, it is, I think, essential for you to focus on these issues. So the first part of today's lecture will deal with the question, what do we actually study as psychologists? What does psychology study as a science? When I ask this question in a room full of students, everyone comes up with a different answer. Some say we study human beings. Other people say we study human soul. Some people say we study cognition or consciousness or some other aspects of human mind. But the general answer is we study psyche or mind. And how can we define psyche? The easiest definition is functional. Psyche is a reflection of the world, and we need this reflection to regulate our individual activity. So, of course, psyche is available not only to humans, but also it exists in animals, because animals also regulate their activity depending on whether they live in more complex or more simple environments. They may have more complex or more simple kinds of psyche. But even some elementary beings, such as amoebas, they also have some mechanisms that allow them to reflect external circumstances in which they are placed and to change their behavior as a function of these circumstances. So one can argue that they have some kind of psyche, even if they don't have a nervous system. And what comprises our psyche? What kind of components exist there? The easiest classification of psychic processes comes from Plato. If you remember Plato's metaphor of human soul, you remember that he proposed a chariot with two horses and a driver. The two horses were our desires, our passions on the one hand, and our emotions on the other hand, and the driver was our reason. Because Plato was a philosopher, he believes that reason was supposed to drive this whole thing. So this classification of mental processes comes back from Plato, but you can still find it basically in any textbook on psychology. We classify everything into cognitive phenomena and cognitive processes such as thinking, speech, memory, perception, sensation, imagination, everything that has to do with the processing of information about the present, information about the past, and projecting information about the future. On the other hand, there are also affective phenomena, emotions, our feelings, our moods, that give us a quick evaluation of the situation in which we are currently. And some people say that emotions and reason, they kind of compete with one another, but actually research shows that they help each other, and that emotions have some cognitive basis, and cognitive processes also rely on emotional signals in order to evolve from one stage to another. And finally, there is the third group of mental processes, motivational processes, the hidden drivers of our behavior, the real reasons why we do the things we do. And if we can present here psyche as an iceberg, you can see that the motivational pole of this iceberg is the most hidden, is the deepest one, because motivation is largely unconscious. But of course, the largest part of all these mental processes are unconscious. Sometimes we think that we consciously are aware of everything that is happening to us, but this is basically an illusion, because we are not aware of what we are not aware. Obviously, right now you're sitting down, and there are also processes in your psyche that help you to maintain your posture, that reflect whether you're comfortable or uncomfortable in different parts of your body, that reflect also the external situation around you. For instance, I'm aware of what is behind me, even though I'm not looking behind myself and I cannot see what's happening there, but I have a mental image of this room. And all of these things are unconscious unless I choose consciously to pay attention to them, or I engage in some form of mindfulness training that tries to kind of expand this sphere of my conscious awareness. So our consciousness only engages in select few situations, in select few moments, because our consciousness engages in situations when a problem cannot be resolved by automatic unconscious processes. For example, you encounter something new, something that is unfamiliar in a very familiar situation, and then you stop and you start reflecting, oh, how do I deal with it? Otherwise, in most situations in our life, we deal actually quite well with just unconscious processes, and we manage to cope with the situations that we face quite well. And somewhere on top of it all, there is personality. No one knows what personality is, although everyone knows that it exists. If you open a book called Theories of Personality, you will find maybe 20 or 30 different theories that describe different aspects of personality, but none of them describes personality as a whole. And these theories sometimes are kind of hard to put together. So personality is a more abstract kind of meta-psychological category rather than a specific notion. It can only be defined within a certain theory of personality. So these are, in a very general way, the mental processes that comprise our psyche. What kind of methods can we use to study them? The problem is that our psyche is like a black box. We cannot observe it directly. For example, human needs. We all have a need for food. If you are hungry, you can be aware of it with your consciousness. And there is a certain behavior, and there are some kind of rituals that are proposed by our culture that we need to follow if we want to eat. But in general, such a thing as a need for food, we can never be sure that it exists. It is a hypothetical construct that we infer by looking at different types of material, but by looking at different sources of information that we can use in order to make hypotheses about these unobservable hypothetical constructs, such as needs that we say exist in our mind. But they exist because we infer them from this range of sources of information. And what are those sources of information? Here on this slide you can see 6 of them. Conscious subjective experience. If I'm hungry, I feel it, I'm aware of it. And this is the most evident, the most accessible source of information that is available to everyone, even if you're not a psychologist. You can consciously be aware of what's happening in your mind. And this was obviously the first source of information that philosophers and early psychologists used when they started to study human mind. But quickly, they realized that actually the extent of our consciousness is very, very limited. And some things that we do, some things that happen in our mind, we can never actually be aware of consciously. And this was discovered, first of all, by Sigmund Freud, who argued in his theoretical approach that actually the really important things about our mind, they are unconscious. The real drivers of our behavior that can be revealed to us in our associations or in our dreams or in our mistakes that we make every day, those things can hardly become conscious unless we make a special effort or unless we study them with special methods. And right now we have also scientific methods to study unconscious processes, such as tests of implicit associations, projective tests, and so on. The third source of information about our mind is, of course, behavior. We can look at each other's behavior and we can, for example, ask our friends to rate our personality traits based on the behavior that they observe. And these ratings have some reliability and have some relationship with self-reports of personality. The fourth source are products of activity. When we want to measure intelligence, we do not ask a person how smart you are from 1 to 7, because we have much more reliable source of information. We can give a person some tasks to solve, and we can use a timer and monitor how many tasks has a person solved within a certain amount of time. So we use this product of activity approach, and this approach, this is called an objective test, basically. The fifth source of information are physiological processes. Basically everything that we can measure, from galvanic skin responses, all kinds of MRIs, EEGs, whatever you can measure using simple physiological measurements that reflects the process in our brain or the process in our body that have something to do with the process in our brain. And finally, there are also social and cultural phenomena. We can look at different words in different languages. For example, I can take the word happiness and see what kind of connotations do words that exist in different languages have that describe happiness. And based on this, I can infer something about people's conceptions of happiness in different cultures and how these conceptions actually may affect their behavior and may affect their views of life and so on. So all these 6 sources of information we can use to try and infer some information about our psyche. And of course, a well-designed study tries to combine several sources of information. Because if you only use self-reports, for example, you can only use questionnaires, nasty reviewers will come and say, can you really trust what people say here? How can you validate? How can you confirm this information with some other, maybe a more objective source of evidence? Why don't you look at people's behavior? Or why don't you use an objective test? Or why don't you correlate with physiological measures and so on? So well-designed study, when they make inferences about human mind, they try to combine several sources of information. So this is, in short, a definition of what we study and how we study it. That we basically you can use this as a general organizing framework. For example, when you see a study, you can ask a question: what it is that they're studying? Is it a cognitive or affective or motivational process? Is it conscious or unconscious? And what kind of source of information are they using to infer information about this? Are these sources really reliable? Is it possible to add some other sources to maybe validate this information, to support these findings with some other corroborating evidence? So these are just 2 general organizing frameworks that you can use when you analyze psychological research.